So I'm here with researcher and journalist Patrick Brown. Patrick is a fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, conservative think tank where he focuses on developing pro-family policy, pro-family economic policy specifically. Patrick is committed to making America more family friendly, but also has interesting criticisms of some of the rhetoric and leadership in the current pro-natalist movement. Patrick is arguably what the pro-family movement needs, an independent thinker with working class American families at heart. We are very lucky to have Patrick here today. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me, Lily.
Awesome. So let's first get into what is pronatalism and do you identify as a pronatalist?
Well, at the most basic level, pronatalism is the idea that we need to be having more babies, both in the United States and around the world. Really, we have some countries that are so far below replacement rate that their population is going to start shrinking. You look at South Korea, you look at Japan. The U.S. isn't anywhere near that level of trajectory in terms of what that could mean for their economy, for their culture, for their society. But we are below replacement rate. We're about 1.6 births per woman. So, if you don't have robust immigration, you're going to see American fertility, American population start to crest and then, conceivably even start to fall. That's a bad sign. We want a country with babies in it. I think babies are good. I think families are good. And so, on some respect, in some dimensions, I totally agree with pronatalism as a movement, but how you get there matters too. And I think this is my biggest critique with some of the most vocal pro-natalist voices, somebody like an Elon Musk or there, some influencers online who talk about pronatalism as just being concerned with, you just got to crank out those babies, man. And I want what's best for those kids, both in terms of what family structure is going to give them the best chance of success, which, in my opinion, looking at the research, is a stable two-parent household. But also, if you're concerned about declining fertility, you have to recognize that the biggest drop among women tends to be among unmarried women. And if you're concerned about declining birth rates, you need to be looking at declining marriage rates as well, because married women still have more children than unmarried women. So it's something that you want to be thinking about this in a holistic way, a sort of an ecology of human flourishing, rather than just focusing on this one statistic and saying, well, that is how we measure, the trajectory that we're facing.
And you say, you think babies are good, we should have more babies. Why is that? What is your pitch for why that's the case?
Oh man. Well, because that is what society is about, I think. I'm a conservative. I'm on the right. I think we have this tremendous inheritance of being, our parents gave birth to us. We have, thousands of years of tradition and civilization that we're custodians of. And for most people, that's gonna be a life a life that's going to have the most meaning for them is going to find a project to invest in. It's, some people that'll be, working for a church or working for a nonprofit or something like that. Maybe those aren't children of their future, and that's fine. But I think for most people, when you look at, again, anecdotally, but also backed up by a lot of survey research, people who have kids find that meaning. They find that purpose. They're not as angst ridden about what my role is here in life. And so I think, without putting too much pressure on kids and babies, like they can provide that sort of orientation for what society should be for handing on our posterity to the next generation, and really having a civilization that has vitality and excitement and, sometimes a little bit of mess along the way. That is a much more optimistic and dynamic future that I want to see, rather than one that's all about trying to divvy up a limited pool of resources to care for an aging population. I don't think people realize that as the baby boomers retire and head into sort of senior citizen status, we're facing a real crunch in terms of, how much money are we going to spend on old age entitlements versus, young parents and their needs too, if we're not having an attention toward the economic as well as the social ramifications of low birth rates. I don't think we're going to like the way that politics looks in 10 or 20 years.
And we'll get into in a bit where, the right and left can kind of find common ground on this issue, but first want to dive into some of your concerns about the current direction that the movement is headed in. So you wrote an article titled Pro-Natalism for Normies. Conservatives who want to stabilize birth rates should drop the weird stuff, where you said instead of sharing a stage with online racists, misogynistic LARPers, or Silicon Valley billionaires with unhealthy obsession with IQ, conservative pro-family voices should be demonstrating a curiosity about how to change the minds of those who disagree with them about the value of building a pro-family society. So yeah, what are some of your issues beyond, I mean, or just expanding on what you just said there,
Yeah.
with the current movement?
Yeah, again, I think there is a sense in which this moment is for a while, it was kind of like some voices in the wilderness who were saying, look at these trend lines, they're not good. Births, we basically hit peak baby in the United States in 2007. And people kind of thought, well, maybe it's the Great Recession, or man, this is going to turn around, but it hasn't. And we've continued every year, goes down. And so it's gone from a sort of niche obsession for kind of people who spend all day, reading spreadsheets, which is great. I love doing that too. To now, again, Elon Musk is probably the most prominent pro-natalist in the world. You have some of the folks who hosted a conference last month, I guess, a couple weeks ago in Austin, Texas, invited a sort of a murderer's row of offbeat personalities who are concerned about low birth rates, not necessarily for the reasons that I share, which is a society that has fewer kids is one that's going to be less dynamic and less, exciting and maybe less full of meaning, but one that says we need to preserve, a certain race, or we need to, reinstate the patriarchy, or I'm sort of exaggerating, but not really. There's a lot of these voices that I think play footsie with some really troubling tendencies, and again, part of the reason why I don't always identify myself necessarily as a pro-natalist, TM, is that you start turning the child in question, the babies in question, from ends in and of themselves, right? What is best for this child? What is best for this family? To means to an end. Well, we need to get the birth rate up so we can beat China, or we need to, do enhanced AI-powered genetic selection before of the embryos we create before we implant them because we need to have the highest IQ possible. I mean, this is the conversations that are happening in Silicon Valley. As somebody who's, more on the working class sort of populist side of things, that really troubles me because then you're turning human reproduction into a project that you're trying to optimize. You're trying to, have it be something that elite, sort of forces are shaping in a way rather than starting with a family and building out. And I think when people hear that, they just kind of instinctively go, "What are you talking about? Why would you want to sort of create eugenics on a mass scale? This is kind of weird." And so that's why I say if we're concerned about declining birth rates, we're concerned about building a nation in which people feel like they have the economic stability and the cultural support to start a family and have kids, you got to cut that stuff out. Because when people hear, well, that's why we got to get women out of the workforce, like they're going to tune you out, and they should, because that's crazy and that's not actually conducive to a healthy, functioning society.
I do want to ask, do you think that part of the movement is going anywhere, or do you think that they will break down somehow, struggle to kind of have any kind of mainstream either popularity or relevance, or do you think that they're actually there's a, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it's always a question of like what's real life, right? Yeah, there's plenty of these online, anonymous Twitter accounts that post all kinds of crazy stuff. The problem is that sometimes they have people who listen to them who are very much in real life. And some of the, a couple weeks ago, the New York Times reported on some ideas that are burbling around in the White House. Maybe we should create a medal for women who, like a national, gold medal that we give to moms who have, 5 or 6 kids, or a baby bonus where you give every mom who has a baby a $5,000 check per child. Some of that I can kind of see the rationale for. Some of those I might have some questions about how we actually implement that. But a lot of those ideas kind of share some energies maybe with some of these less healthy impulses. And so it's important to distinguish between, again, a baby bonus or a larger child tax credit. There's nothing, offensive about that at all. I support both of those ideas. But sometimes some of the people who are most visible promoting them. Again, an Elon Musk, for example, or Pavel Durov, who's the founder of the messaging app Telegram. He's a Russian billionaire who said any woman who wants to have IVF can have it for free so long as they use his genetic material. And he claims to have fathered, I think, 100 kids now. That's weird. That's totally weird. And if your movement gets wrapped up in that as a symbol of what pronatalism looks like, I turn it off too. I mean, that's just not the kind of society I want to live in, where some rich guy in Russia can, pay for, women to sort of form his, it's like a modern day harem in a sense. And I think that's really off-putting to most normal Americans.
Yeah, it'll be very interesting to see kind of who wins out in this struggle between the populist right and the tech bro right. It's very interesting to watch.
Yeah.
So where do you think the left and right can start to find common ground on the issue of both declining birth rates and pro-family policy? Although that's kind of two questions.
Yeah, I mean they're related, obviously. Not everything that's pro-natal is pro-family, not everything is pro-family pro-natal, but often there's a lot of overlap. And on the left, I have to always give credit to my friends on the left, especially more on the sort of Bernie socialist side of things. They've always been very focused on questions of the economics of family formation, looking at countries like Scandinavia, France and other places that have been, the leaders and sort of trying to create public subsidies for parents, childcare and all the rest. You know, for a while it was looking like, if you read pieces from like the mid 2000s, people will say, "Hey, look, Scandinavian birth rates are actually higher than they are here. They're doing something right. This is the solution." Since then, they're actually slumped just, basically where we are, even lower. So I don't think it's true that the sort of Scandinavian left-leaning model of pro-family policy is actually, the pathway to higher birth rates. I think, again, you have to be thinking about the context. And I think it starts with the family and marriage. And I think that's where the left can sometimes get a little bit of the heebie-jeebies. And again, I'm not here to say that they're not picking up on nothing, right? There are clearly some strands in conservatism that have sexist, misogynistic views. That's, I'm can honestly say that. I like to think that they're a pretty fringe minority, but sometimes they get the loudest megaphone because people click on controversy and get headlines and all the rest. So, um, you know, if you're on the left, I think part of where the hesitation comes in is, well, if I admit that families are good, or that it's actually better to have, better for kids to have two parents in the household rather than one, oh, now I'm making common cause with these, regressive, patriarchal, homophobic, whatever else, name your sort of basket of deplorables. And that can, I think, lead to a sort of excessive fear of wanting to make a normative claim. And it's based in a good impulse, which is we don't want to put people down. The childless cat lady stuff. I mean, that's not helpful by any means. But there's a way that we can uphold what's good and what's valuable and what's beneficial to society, as well as, the adults and kids in question, and say, look, the ideal, or on average, it's going to be better if more people have kids, if they are committed to their partner. And we can say that freely. We should, we have, again, plenty of social science to back that up, plenty of sort of instinctual, tradition to back that up. We can do that without punishing people who have kids, when they weren't expecting to, or unplanned pregnancy or whatever. We can do that without scorning people who find their meaning, serving others in a religious vocation, or some sort of, non-profit type role. There's plenty of people who do that, who don't end up having biological children. And I don't think you need to throw them under the bus. You need everybody pulling, having this sort of commitment. And so I think that's where sometimes the left can kind of freeze up when these conversations take place. But what they don't have any issue spending money. And so the question is, can the right come to the table on, opening the checkbook a little bit? And can the left come to the table on recognizing that, maybe conservatives have a point about the relationship between marriage, family, childbearing, and all the rest? There's some lessons that we can glean from that I think can help, construct a healthy way forwards. But it requires trust from both sides, and that's in short supply.
That is very true. And I think the more that we talk about and focus on encouragement and not punishment, the more willing everyone on all sides is
Right.
to have these discussions, definitely. And so in that vein, I think both the everyone in America right now is struggling with an increasingly hyper individualistic culture and a world that seems to not fit or be conducive to meaning and flourishing. And I think those on the right and left in their own ways seem to be searching for more meaning through their connection with others as a result. And I think I see on the left a lot of rhetoric about finding community, building community. On the right, you see more rhetoric about, family, supporting families, religion. I'd be very curious to see what your thoughts are on that kind of parallel that's happening. Do you think they're connected? Yeah.
I think you're right to notice the crisis of meaning and how it shakes out differently. And in some respects, it's a pre-political problem, right? This isn't something, it's amplified by social media and by, polarization and all the rest. But I think it has deeper roots in the sense that we live in there's a I don't know how deep you want me to go here. There's a famous conservative sociologist from the 1950s, Robert Nisbet, who talks about the quest for community and what we traded off in the name of autonomy and individual freedom. A lot of that is good. A lot of that, most of us would want to live in the world of, the 1920s or something. Um, we're Americans. Like there's that sort of small L libertarian sense of like it's a free country, man, don't tell me what to do. And that's good, but it can be taken too far. And I think that part of the challenge, once you trade community and, maybe a little bit of conformism for individualism and autonomy, realize how you don't know what it's got you got till it's gone, right? As the song goes, like there's definitely um a sense where we've maybe over optimized. Again, I don't want to push this too hard because there's a lot that was wrong with the social structures of the whatever 19th century or something, but as we've become richer, as we've been able to outsource more of our needs and our relationships even to the market, where there used to be certain goods that you could only have if you were married or in a sort of tight-knit community. Now you can order up anything you need on DoorDash or find a sex partner for the night on an app or whatever. I mean, these are things that you used to only be able to have through marriage, right? And so it's freeing in a sense, but it's also a different, trading in one set of handcuffs for another. And now I think we worry rather than the sort of 1950s company man, gray suit type of, Mad Men era conformity. Now I think we're all looking for where can I find my people? Where can I belong? And sometimes that cashes out in unhealthy political attachments. Clearly, that's the case. But I think that hunger for wanting to be among people who get you is at the core of so much of what's going wrong. And I think if we can recognize that in each other and across the political divide and say, look, your version of community might not be mine. A group of stay-at-home moms in Salt Lake City is going to have a different, rhythm to life than a sort of collective of non-conforming parents in Brooklyn, right? I mean, this is part of the beauty of American federalism, but recognizing that impulse and that desire, I think can direct our policymaking in a way that respects that pluralism and celebrates it rather than trying to either say, well, we're all just individuals here. If you want to have a child, that's on you. Like, don't raise my taxes to pay for your child tax credit. Or the other, impulse sometimes is to say, well, everybody needs to fit this mold. We're going to pass universal programs that everybody's got to, participate in, and it's going to be top down from DC. Those are the two competing impulses that I see in our politics. And I think finding something that's, on a different dimension can help us kind of break through some of those divides.
Yeah, I think it'll be very interesting to see on, I guess, the new right, new left, or the post-neoliberal right and left, where there's room for conversation about community and connection. Because I do think I'm just seeing it more and more, and we're talking
Yeah.
about it in very different ways, and it's manifesting in different ways, but there's a serious parallel there that I hope gets more attention. So moving on to kind of the solutions part of the conversation, what are the biggest roadblocks preventing American families from flourishing?
Oh man. Well, again, this is what I would maybe distinguish from the pro-natal versus the pro-family side of the conversation, or maybe even more directly the pro family formation versus the pro parent side of the conversation. Because once you have kids, I think the conversation shifts, right? I think we're worried about tech and what it means when children now have the opportunity to form friendships with sort of AI parasocial bot. Essentially, you read these stories of teenagers kind of losing themselves and people who aren't real. I think parents don't know what to do. I think there's a lot of room for better urban design and some of the things that kind of relieve parents from some of the pressures of raising kids. We can have that conversation. I think that's a good, important conversation. But and in some respects, those are often, can I walk my kid to school, or can I help get him off his smartphone? These are conversations that often cut through the partisan cleavages in a very helpful way. But I think that's different than the conversation around, can I form a relationship in the first place? Can I have, find someone to have a child with in the first place? And that is a much harder conversation. I think that is going to be the challenge, facing our politics in the foreseeable future, is that young men and young women, especially, are on the side of diverging political trends. And we saw this in 2024, where especially college educated women just off the charts on the sort of progressive, public opinion scale. Young men staying pretty much where they are, or maybe even becoming a little more conservative. You're looking at the Joe Rogan kind of crowd, the podcast bro demographic. And if young men and young women aren't finding each other, I think that is a disaster because, again, obviously there's lots of different ways of forming relationships but the sort of modal experience for most young men and young women is going to be a heterosexual pairing off. That's where most children are born into. And so if we're concerned about birth rates, we should be concerned about finding their special someone. And if we're not training men to be the type of person worth getting involved with, and we're not helping have that conversation about, are there these barriers that are getting in the way. It's not all economics. I think sometimes the populist right sometimes over indexes on, well, we used to be able to, make things with our hands, and tariffs will lead to a, blue collar renaissance, and therefore all the young men will get married. And it's like, well, that was a very different America. And then oftentimes young women felt like there was no other option but to marry the guy down to the assembly line. Now they have a lot more options. And now we need men to be the type of person who young women would be interested in marrying in the first place. I think that's a much different project. It's a tougher project because it cuts against the sort of you do you spirit of the Joe Rogans of the world, where it's not about becoming a better person, but it's about just leave me alone and let me smoke my weed and play video games all day, right? That's a different conversation, but ultimately that's a much more fundamental challenge to family formation, I think, than what the marginal tax rate is on family benefits or whatever.
So what are some of your thoughts about how we can create a culture in politics that is more focused on um, making it affordable and enjoyable to raise a family in America?
Yeah, I don't want to downplay the economic angle by any means. I think housing in particular, we know, has a direct relationship with family formation. Part of the baby boom in the post World War II era, it wasn't just that soldiers came home from fighting, the Nazis, and everybody was happy to see each other. That was part of it, but also we had a massive government program, essentially, the GI Bill, home loans and whatnot, that effectively standardized a 30-year mortgage, made this something that lots of Americans, not every American, lots of racial discrimination at play, but for white Americans especially, became a sort of pathway to the middle class. And once home ownership became an expectation, we saw fertility rates boom. We know that when house prices go up, in more recent research, looking at the 2000s and 2010s, when house prices go up, people who own their homes feel more confident, more comfortable. They're more likely to have a kid. If you're renting, like if you're in California and you literally can't afford a down payment in a million years, then you're much settling down with someone, much less adding another mouth to feed. And agenda is actually a pro-family agenda in a lot of respects. And again, this is where the solutions of the left and right are going to look a little different. Maybe me and Ezra Klein might agree on a lot of the sort of abundance stuff that he's been pushing around deregulating housing and that sort of thing. Maybe he has more time for some of the public housing experiments that you see in other countries. Maybe not. I don't know. But we won't have a more pro-family America if we can't make it affordable to live. And so that's why I think housing is a big part of this. We can talk, there's obviously always kind of stuff on the margins too, education and healthcare and some of the rest. I'm still a believer in free markets. I think in general, reduce or increasing the supply and reducing some of the regulatory burdens and letting markets do what they do best is more often than not the right angle to take, but it can be done too much too. And so I think, finding that balance, that's what politics is all about. But having the family as our focus, having it be easier, especially for young people, because your earnings go up as you get older, right? And so a couple who's in their late 20s might not have the same earning power that they will 15 or 20 years from now, but you face an almost inescapable biological fact that it becomes harder to have a kid as you get older. If we can help them think about or help policy reorient, or we're not pushing people to, feel like they need to extend their sort of early career years until they're ready to settle down, and actually make it easier for people to have kids even in college or right after college, get married, in their mid 20s rather than their mid 30s. That's actually going to help both birth rates in general, but more specifically, I think give people that sense of stability that a lot of people are looking for.
In terms of the kind of cultural um, roadblocks, I think, you spoke about the relationship that young men and women have, or I guess don't have with each other right now. But also, I think a lot of modern parents feel like they're on an island, and that the community that maybe parents, I guess, in the past used to enjoy doesn't really exist. And I think one, I'd love to hear you speak to that. And two, are there policies that can kind of help with that situation, or is that just going to be a cultural transformation? Um,
Yeah, it's tricky, right? And this is where I want to choose my words carefully because, well, there's a feedback loop. As fewer people have kids, it becomes less. You're more of a weirdo, maybe, or you stand out a little more if you do have a kid, and so that social fabric that maybe parents in the 60s or 70s could rely on. Hey, can you watch Little Johnny for me while I run to the store? Now, if you're the only one in your social circle who's had a kid at age 30 and everyone else is still, single or has yet to kind of settle down, that becomes a lot more of a burden because it's not sort of part of the rhythm of life in the same way. Is that a policy question? Not really, but it does point to the fact that there are these externalities that exist to having kids. When you become a parent, you start to get more invested in the local school board. You start to notice, the quality of the streets, or the curb cuts and the sidewalk. Wow, this is really not that accessible. I can't push my stroller here. Imagine what this is like for somebody who's mobility impaired or whatever. You start to see the world in a different way. And so I think as parenthood becomes more self-selected, more rare, where we know that people aren't having the number of kids that, at least in public opinion polls, they say they would like to, something's not quite right there. And so if we can think about ways of rebuilding that village, right? And this is where, I mean, this is like before our time, right? But Hillary Clinton back in, I think it was the 92 election, said like it takes a village to raise a child. And she got, hammered by I don't know, whoever was, running Newt Gingrich or whoever at the time saying, "Oh, you just want the government to raise your children." And it's like, no, there's a real point there, which is that raising a family in isolation is incredibly difficult. It's incredibly difficult if you're a single parent and you don't have another adult in the household that trade nighttime feedings with, or to balance getting kids to soccer practice and the rest. It's also difficult if you don't know any other families, right? Or if you feel like you're living across the country from your extended family, whatever the case happens to be, it can be isolating. And so to the extent that we can be building opportunities for people to meet in civic life, right? Better public spaces where you don't feel afraid to take your kids, more local schools, more rather than big centralized locations out in the suburbs somewhere, pushing policy and pushing opportunities down to a local level rather than sort of centralizing some of these things at the state or federal level. I think that can actually respect a sort of fine-grained vision of what human flourishing looks like. Again, going to look different in different parts of the country. It's going to look different in the south or the north or the west or the east, all the rest. But if we can respect that as being what society is ultimately really about, rather than just like, well, did the GDP, did the stock market, do this or that the other day, I think that's actually something that both the sort of, you know, populist left and populist right are recognizing and wanting to push back against in different ways.
And then how do you think that we can promote, again, a culture and politics that encourages um, people to have families and makes it possible for people to have families, but also doesn't shame women, especially who choose not to?
Yeah. I think this is the real challenge. I is even I feel a little, uncomfortable talking about it sometimes because it's a just a biological fact that women face a much narrower window in which they can have kids. Bill Belichick and his girlfriend could have a baby if they want to. But a gender role flipped relationship would not work. Once you hit menopause, and so for women especially, having those frank conversations of saying, "Look, this is something that." For a lot of people ends up providing a lot of value, a lot of meaning in their life. And again, it isn't for everyone. It's a lot of work, but it's so worth it. And it's such a relief in a sense where you're no longer trying to figure out your place in the world, but you have someone where your life can be about. Nobody in their very few people in their deathbeds say like, "Oh, I wish I, spent more time, gunning for that promotion or whatever." A lot of people say, look back and say, think about all that time with my family, right? And so that's a very difficult conversation for a man to have with a woman, but I think women should are having that conversation. There's a recognition that the sort of lean in feminism of the sort of girl boss era isn't the right model for everybody, and that we need to have more open conversations about that. um I think again on the right, obviously there's plenty of people who kind of lapse into this sort of, well, back in the Leave It to Beaver days, we had all this figured out. It's like that actually sucked, right? For a lot of women who went to college, got married, and then felt very isolated, felt like they weren't using their talents and their gifts the way that they could. And there was a reason why the feminism of the 1960s kind of rebelled against that, because it wasn't allowing them to participate in society in a meaningful way. And so, going back is not going to be the answer. It has to be a new synthesis. And I think one positive, piece of evidence of this is that after COVID, actually, during COVID and in the last couple of years, we've seen that dads are spending more time with their kids now, and they're taking a more active role in, again, soccer practice and all the rest, changing diapers. You see this in the time use data. You see this just anecdotally, more dads in the playgrounds, that sort of thing. I think that's really helpful, really healthy, and helps reorient what the balance between career and family can look like. If everybody is sort of making these trade-offs in the way that best fits them, we have to have that conversation. We have to say, look, time isn't infinite. We need to be thinking about, helping, uh, people who are in grad school for 15 years. That's probably not really conducive to having a family. But for most people, if we can get them started thinking about these things earlier, uh, that's going to be better for them, I think, better for society in general. And those, that's different than how do we increase wages and how do we, what's the right tax rate? These are kind of the boring conversations that get too much attention in DC. These more fundamental questions about what is life actually meant to be about. I think that's where you could have some really fun conversations.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of kind of weird voices that at times are championing this conversation, but I think the more it becomes about, again, encouragement and not shaming, and the more it becomes a bipartisan conversation, the more you'll see, I think, women on the left too being willing to talk about this kind of stuff and talk about pro-family policy and talk about meaning and children and all that. So I want to ask you one last question before we go. If you could snap your fingers and implement any pro-family policy across the United States that would have the most impact, what would that be?
Man, that is it sort of goes against my ethos because I'm a big like there's no silver bullet guy, right? Like I there's it's not the case that one thing overall would change things to make America a more pro-family country. I mean, I would love to see, again, more walkable streets and cities and a place where more families knew each other and that sort of thing. But the tangible side of like something that could actually pass Congress, right? I think, for me, it's still the baby bonus idea, and not necessarily in a, or I should say explicitly not in the way that somebody like an Elon Musk or even a Donald Trump has sort of alluded to as a, well, we're gonna have a incentive so people can go out and have a baby that they wouldn't have otherwise had. That's not the right way to think about it. We're not, I don't want to try to use the power of the government to change people's preferences on something so intimate as family formation, right? I think that's kind of a weird goal to have. But we can recognize that parents have costs that non-parents don't. And it's not discriminatory to say, look, when you get pregnant and you're thinking about buying the stroller and the diaper and the car seat and the wipes and the clothes and all that stuff adds up, you're doing a tremendous service to the rest of us by taking on the burden of giving birth and then raising the child for the next 18 years. Some upfront assistance is really valuable, especially when you're taking time off of work to have a baby, to support your partner who's having a baby. So doing a baby bonus in a way recognizes that sort of income volatility that says, look, parents bear these costs. If you're not a parent, you don't bear these costs, but parents are doing really important work. And we should structure it in such a way, and we can, this will be a different conversation another time. I'll leave you with this provocative note. We can structure it in a way that recognizes, again, that it's really important, especially for moms who are very vulnerable at this time, right? You've just given birth, you're often still, bleeding, you're healing, you're, very vulnerable. It's really important to have a supportive partner there. And so having dad there to, take care of baby, let mom get some sleep, building that into how we approach policy and recognizing that it's actually something that's worth supporting is having more babies born in two-parent households. I think that is going to be, has to be part of the conversation, in my opinion, if we want babies to thrive, moms to thrive, everybody to be healthy and happy. I think constructing policy in a way that recognizes that and affirms the ideal. Again, not punishing single moms, but just saying, look, it's better on average when there's more parents there to share the load. That's how I would design a baby bonus, maybe $4,000 for a two-parent household, $2,000 for a single parent household. And that kind of creates this important signal that the United States of America cares about parents, cares about babies, and wants to be a more pro-family country.
Very interesting. Okay. Thank you so much for talking with me today. This was I think, conversation people will be having more as time goes on. And it's great to talk with someone who is, again, an independent thinker and has, American families, I think, best interests at heart. So thank you so much.
Well, I hope so. I hope to see much more conversation about this, and I was happy to chat.